My name is Sarah, and today I'm going to talk to you a bit more about version control. This is part of a series of videos that's going to cover the basics of version control. Now, this is the second video in the series, so I've already covered what version control is. This time I'm going to show you how to get started with it and how to use the most basic functionality of version control, which is making a repository, cloning that repository, committing files to it, pushing them up to the cloud, and pulling files down from the cloud. So those are all the main steps for using version control. They're the day-to-day steps. Now, they are not the steps that will help you when something goes really wrong, and that will be covered in a later tutorial, but these are the day-to-day steps to get started using version control in your projects. The first step to getting started with your version control is to create a GitHub account. Now, this is only applicable if you are using GitHub. This tutorial will be showing you how to use GitHub and Github Desktop, and the version control system we'll be using is Git. So if you want to use something else, you'll have to look up the documentation for those tools. It will be very similar. The process overall will be very much the same, but the individual actions you might need to take in the GUI or on the website may be different. All right, so GitHub is found at github.com. And it's a very common open source software repository website, but you can use it for non-open source projects. You can create private repositories, and all of it's free. Now, the only thing that may cost more money is if you have quite a large team that all want to connect to the same private repository. In that case, you will have to pay. Or if you have very large projects that take up a lot of space, you will have to pay. But overall, for most projects, especially smaller projects, student projects, GitHub is absolutely adequate and you won't have to pay anything. So the first step is to actually create your GitHub account. So if you're on the main GitHub page, you can see there's a place to sign in the top right, or you can just put your email address in this location. Once you do either of those things, either clicking sign up or putting your email address here, you'll be taken to the sign up page. So here you can see I already have an account, my Coding Dino account, so it's trying to fill that in there, but you would want to put in a username, an email address, and a password. Now, my recommendation here is to use a professional address, a professional username. If you're in the games industry, it's okay if it doesn't have to be boring. Like, I use Coding Dino as my professional GitHub account. And I have an icon that looks like a dinosaur. I like dinosaurs. It shows my personality. That's okay. But don't use anything inappropriate, anything with sexual references, racism. I would even avoid things like toilet humor, swear words. Avoid that kind of stuff, drug references, all that sort of thing. Anything you wouldn't want an employer to see, don't put here, because your GitHub account can basically be your portfolio and often is for many programmers. So definitely keep this professional so that other people can look at it. You can share your code with other people through GitHub and not have to be embarrassed or worried about that. Okay? You'll have to fill out this little puzzle in order to actually verify your account. You will then be able to create an account, and from there, you will need to then verify your email address. So make sure the email address that you use here is one that you can actually access and check. Once you have created your GitHub account and logged in, you should see something that looks a bit like this page. You will have some suggestions for creating a repository over here on the left. You will have basically a lot of nothing here because you haven't made anything yet. So the first thing you're going to need to do before we can really move forward is to create a repository. And this is something you'll do every time you're going to start a new project. So you will not have multiple projects in a single repository. One repository per project, okay? So say you're getting ready to make a new game, you would create a new repository. And to do that, you're going to you can click on this create repository button, but if you've already made some, that will not be there. So you can also click, I know you can't see it here, but it's in the top right corner underneath my face. And you will click the little plus sign that's there and click new repository. From that, you'll be taken to this page. All right, so you can see here, it will automatically put your name as the owner, your account that you've just created, and you can then put in a repository name. Be descriptive. Don't just call it game, right? If you don't have a name for your game yet, use a working title. Make up something to use for now. It's good to have a working title for your game anyway. It doesn't have to be the final title that the game ends up being called, but have a working title for it, make it descriptive. Right now, we're going to not use a game title because this is going to be a practice repository. So if you're following along, go ahead and put something in there like practice repository, test repository, that sort of thing. So I'm going to call mine test repo. Repo is short for repository, not for repossession. They're not coming to take your belongings or your organs. It is a repository. Repo is for repository. So if you see the word repo or repos, it means repository or repositories. All right? Now, it's good to put in a description. It's not required, but you can put one in here now, something like test repository created for a tutorial. Something like that to make it clear what this is. If this was for a game, you could describe the game, or if you might want to say what class it's for, if it's for one of your classes, to help you remember. All right, now you can make this private or public. If you're doing this for a class, for example, for one of my classes, you probably want to make it public so that I can check your work. All right, so if it's private, I won't be able to check your work. So you want to make it public if it's for one of my classes so I can actually go on and look at your work. Okay, but if you're making something that you want to release commercially in the future, you probably want to make that private instead. Right, now these things at the bottom you don't need to worry about right now. I will be covering a gitignore, a .gitignore file in a future tutorial, but for now you can leave it blank. We won't need it for this tutorial. So just leave everything else blank and click Create Repository. This should create for you a brand new repository with the name that you chose. All right, so from here, this is sort of the repository screen, and it still actually isn't looking quite how it will once we get this repository properly started because we've not made any commits to this repository yet, but that's okay. All right, so we've created our repository. The next thing we need to do is actually download and install another program called Github Desktop. So the next step in our tutorial is to actually download the application, the GUI, the graphical user interface, the application that is going to talk to the command line Git system and is going to also help send our code up to the website that we just created and back that code up and also pull it back down. So this is called Github Desktop, and you can get to this by going to desktop.github.com. Github Desktop is a really simple tool. It's a really nice and easy one. And as you can see, it's really easy to download. You just click this big button in the middle. It should open up a download dialog for you and just save it wherever you wish. All right, once that's saved, you want to open it. It isn't a very big download, so it shouldn't take very long to complete. Once the download is completed, go ahead and open up the exe, and I'll go through the steps of installation with you. All right, once you download and open up the GitHub installer, you should see something like this. So you'll probably want to use github.com, not enterprise, unless you happen to have an account through maybe a company that you work for or something like that. But in general, if you've just made an account with us just in the previous step, you'll want to use this blue button on the left. So you'll sign into github.com. It should open back up your web browser, and if you're already signed in the web browser, it should allow you to just authorize the app right there. So I can click Authorize Desktop. Now, if for some reason you weren't using your default web browser on your computer to log in earlier, you may have to log in again, or you may just want to go back into Windows and change what your default browser is, or whatever you need to do and retry this, because it does need to go through the website using this authentication method. All right, so once this has popped up, you can just click this green button to authorize the desktop app to your GitHub account. And then it's going to ask you if you can open that exe again that you just had. You can go ahead and click Open in GitHub exe, and it will pop this back up, and it should continue on. So you'll then be asked to configure Git. You should go ahead and put in your name and email that you use to sign into GitHub, because this will be attached to your commits whenever you log in, or whenever you look at your commits on GitHub, and you can see who has committed each part of the project. It will include your name and this email here. So you want to use the same one that you've used for GitHub already. That way it'll all match up. So I'm going to put in here Sarah Herzog, because that's what I used on GitHub, and I used my Fife College email address. Okay. So from that point, you go ahead and click continue, and it will have set everything up with those settings. You can choose whether or not you want to submit anonymous data. It does help them check for things like crash reports and such. I go ahead and leave it ticked off, but you can untick it if you don't wish to submit any anonymous data. It won't change your actual use of the program at all. Okay, so this is what you will end up with if you have gotten to this point. You'll notice on the left there's a few options, and here on the right are your repositories, and we already made a repository, so there's actually one there. So if we click that repository, we're going to have some options. Right? So you can create a tutorial repository. You can go through GitHub's tutorial, or you can go ahead and click clone on the one you've already made, like so. Once you click clone, it's going to automatically fill in the URL for your repository on GitHub. If you're using a different website for hosting your repositories, you can actually still clone them using this method. You just put in the URL for that particular repository, no matter where it's hosted. Now notice this is not a normal URL. It has a .git at the end. So wherever you're hosting your repositories, there'll be like a special button that you can click to access your actual Git URL for your repository. It's not the same as the address in the web bar at the top, so be careful about that. All right, so you're going to leave that alone because it's automatically filled it in properly. The local path you're going to want to put to wherever you want your repositories to go. Now, word of warning for my students at Fife College and anyone who is on a computer that is using a remote location for the desktop and documents folder. At our college, we do this. And it's nice because it lets you have the same documents and desktop when you go from computer to computer. But the way that it's set up, for some reason, not only GitHub, but also Unity, Visual Studio, and many other programs do not play nice with the desktop and documents folder. So if your computer is set up that way to have this sort of remote hosting system, do not use the desktop and documents folder. If, however, you're at home, on your personal computer at home, there's no reason not to put it in documents. You can put this wherever you like. Now, I personally recommend setting up an overall folder called repos or something, GitHub, whatever you want to call it. And inside that, you would put in a test folder. So in the example here, GitHub has already done that. It's gone to the documents folder, the default location for the documents folder on your computer, wherever that is. It's decided it's going to create a folder called GitHub inside the documents folder. And within that will be another new folder named after your repository, in this case, test repo. Okay, that is the structure I would recommend. So you have an overall folder called GitHub or repos or whatever you want, and that will contain many different repositories, many different projects. And then you have a separate folder inside that for each of your individual projects. So that's what I've got set up here. And just one last reminder, if you're on a Fife College computer, do not put this in documents. Instead, put this in, for example, your U drive or somewhere else, but not in documents, not in desktop. Okay? All right, once you've got it set up in a place where you like it, if you're happy with that path, go ahead and click clone. This will create the new folders as needed, and it will copy any files that are in that repository onto your computer. So that's what cloning does. It makes a copy of the entire repository, and it takes it down from the host website, and it puts it onto your computer. And it hooks that repository up to GitHub. So not only are the files copied down, the repository is now visible in GitHub, and we'll see why that's important in a moment. Now in our case, our repository was empty. There were no files in there because we just created it. It was just an empty repository, an empty folder, because repositories are really just folders with a bunch of stuff inside them, usually. In this case, none yet. Okay, so this is the default view for a GitHub repository. This is what you would see. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and close this background window. This is what you would see on a GitHub repository. And on the left here, you will see changes, which there are none. We can see there's no local changes. Along the top, we see the name of the repository. We see the current branch. We are not going to cover branches in this tutorial. They are a more advanced subject, but the current branch is called master, and that just means it's the main branch. And then there's a place to publish, and it has a really, really weird error message right now. Cannot publish unborn head. That just means we haven't made any commits yet, so don't be afraid of that commitment, of that error message. It's absolutely fine. Okay, our next step is to actually take a look at this repository. We are going to figure out where it's located in our computer, because this has downloaded, or well, in this case, created a file. There wasn't anything to download yet, but if there was, it would have downloaded those files, and it will have created a folder for those files to exist in on our computer at the path that we stated. Now, if you can't remember what that path was, or in the future you forget, there's a really easy way to find it from within GitHub. You just go to the repository menu at the top and you choose Show in Explorer. That will open up a lovely folder like this. You can see on the top, it's in the location that I did tell it to go into to begin with. And mine isn't actually empty. You can see there is a .git folder and it's kind of grayed out. That's because I have hidden files and folders turned on. And you should turn that on now too if you don't have it turned on. How do you do that? At the top, if you're on Windows 10, at the top you go to View. And on the right-hand side, there's two options I have ticked here. One is File Name Extensions and one is Hidden Items. Turn on both of these. They're very important for development. It's going to be difficult for you to actually do your development without seeing these two things. So turn on File Name Extensions and Hidden Items. Once you do that, you should see this sneaky .git folder. Never, ever do anything with this folder. Do not rename it. Do not add things to it. Do not delete it or things inside it. This folder is automatically managed by GitHub Desktop, or by Git technically, and it will contain all of the snapshots, commits of your project. It is what has all of the information about your repository in it. All of the messages for your commits, all of the changes and different versions of the files, all of that is located inside that .git folder. So it's very important never to touch it. Your repository is not as a whole, the place where your repository exists and where it can check for changes is not inside that folder. It's inside the folder that has that folder. Now that's very confusing. But what I mean is this test repo folder that you've created, that is your repository. The .git folder just has the information in it, but the overall test repo folder is the one that has your whole repository in it. So I know that's a bit confusing. The .git is like the data, the background data for the repository, but the whole folder test repo, or whatever you've chosen to name yours, that's the repository itself. So your repository is a folder. Now the important thing here is that it will only notice changes to the project that are inside that overall folder, that test repo folder, test repository or practice repository, whatever you've called it, or whatever future folder you make, it will only detect changes inside that. Okay, so let's make a change. Let's practice this. How do we do that? Let's go ahead and right-click on the folder that you're in, just the white background, not on the .git. We're inside test repo. We're going to right-click, and inside here we're going to go to New, and we're going to choose text document, right? Text document. And we're going to create a test text document. Let's call it test.text. Test.text. And we're going to add only a single line of text inside our test document. I know those two words are really similar and it's confusing. Open that up, and you should open it up in Notepad, just something really simple to edit with. And let's just type the words, "This is a test." Okay, and save that. You can use Control S, or you can go to File and Save. And you can go ahead and close this now. So we have now created a test.txt file, and we've put some random text inside. You can actually type whatever you want in there. And that's now been added. So we have changed our project. This file is inside test repo. So it is inside our repository, and it has been changed. The whole point of version control is to detect and track changes. So let's go back to GitHub Desktop and see what we can see. All right, here is GitHub Desktop. I'm going to minimize this folder. Here is GitHub Desktop. We can see on the left one changed file. And if that is selected, you can see on the right what the changes were to that file. Notice there is it was green, but I've highlighted it, so now it's blue, a green plus sign here, meaning the file was added. And on the right, notice this is green, and there's a little plus sign. That means that line of text was added. So we can see our changes inside GitHub. Fantastic. Now we need to actually take a snapshot. So right now, our version control still has not saved anything. There is still no snapshots. There is no change log. There is nothing like that. If we want to actually create a snapshot out of our project at this point in time that we could then go back to in the future, we have to make what's called a commit. So it does not happen automatically. You must, every so often as you're working, go and make a commit. How often do you do that? Well, it's up to you. Usually every time I'm ready to test my project, every time I'm ready to test and see if the feature that I've been making works, if it works, I go commit it, okay? So it should be fairly often. You would usually commit multiple times a day. At the very least, you'd commit when you finished each day. You do not want to commit broken code though, so be very careful. Because someone, especially if you're working in a team, it's really important not to commit broken code because you don't want anyone else to pull down your code and then be unable to test their work. So you don't usually want to commit broken code, but you do want to commit regularly, multiple times per day usually. At the very least, at the end of your work session, you should commit. Okay, so, right, okay, how do we commit? How do we actually do that, Sarah? Well, here's how you do it. It's very easy in GitHub Desktop. First of all, you'll notice there's a tick box on the side of this file. Everything that is ticked will be part of the commit. So you don't have to commit all the files that you've changed, but usually you want to, especially as a beginner. You generally want to commit all the files that have changed. And at the bottom, you're going to put the commit message. Now, some and many other GUI programs for Git will not have two separate sections here, message and description. Instead, they'll just have one. So I'm used to writing everything in a single line, but you may wish to use the description as well as the message. It's entirely up to you. Just make sure that you are clear. So whenever you write a commit message, it must be very clear. It should describe what you have done. So in our case, we have added a test text file. That's what we did. All right. If you were programming something and you added the player movement, you could say added player movement with WASD keys. Or if you were, adding some art to the game, you could say added images for the flower and the tree, or whatever it was that you added. Right. So just be really clear about what you've changed. If you fixed a bug, one thing that I've worked in studios, they often do is they'll include the bug ID number that you were working on. Or if you're using a task system, you would include the task ID number that you're working on, and there can be tools that can cross-reference those and link them all together, which is really, really useful, because then later if you're like, how'd they fix this bug? I have the same thing again. I need to see how it was done. You can click it. So just basically give as much information as you can here within reason. Okay, in this case, one sentence is plenty. That's all we need. But you may need to write more if you've done a lot of complicated changes. All right, once all that's done, right, you've ticked this thing that you want to commit, you've written your message, you're going to click this bottom button, commit to master. Now that sounds really weird and slightly kinky. Don't worry, all right, it's not. Master is the name of the branch that you're on. It just means the main branch. All right, there's a lot of different words for it in different languages or different systems. In Git, it's typically called master, and that's the main branch that you are working on. So commit to master just means commit your changes to the master branch. Once you click that, you have no changed files anymore, which you're like, oh, but I still changed it. Where'd it go? Okay, well, now the new, most recent version of the project is the same as your current version, so there won't be any changes from that most recent version. Right? You can check the folder and you can see that your file is indeed still there. All right, it's still there. If you open it up, it still has your text that you wrote into it. So it didn't go away or anything. It's just now been integrated into the current, most up-to-date version of the project. If you click on history, you will see your commit listed there, and the more commits you make, they'll all be listed out, and it will be very clear and easy to see what you've done each time you've committed to the project. Okay, so that's great, but if you go back to the website and we go back to github.com and check your repository, you will still see this looking exactly as it did before. All right, if you click on code, there will still be nothing there. So the problem here is that we have not actually, we have made this snapshot, but when you make a snapshot, it is only on your computer. So your computer has a history of all the different versions of your project, but the hosting website does not. So the problem is we need to communicate between our computer's version of the repository with all the different copies of the project, which is only one right now, but you get the idea for the future. We want to send all of those up to the hosting website. And that term for sending all that information up is called pushing. So we're pushing all the information up from our computer to the hosting website. Okay, and the specific word for the version of the repository that is on the hosting website is called the origin. So you'll often see the phrase push to origin, and that means we're pushing it up to the hosting website. So hosting website is the version of the repository that's on that hosting website is called origin. Okay, so how do we do this? Let's take a look back at GitHub Desktop. So here in GitHub Desktop, we now have a button that says Publish Branch. Now this will only say publish the first time. Once you have published your branch and you later are going to push something up, it'll say push. So publish is push. It's just the first time it's called publish when you have nothing yet on the website. Okay, so we're going to click publish, but really in your heads think this is the push button, right? This is the button I'm using to push my repository up to the cloud. Okay, so go ahead and click publish, and it will spin for a minute as it's pushing to origin. You can see there it is using the word push and the word origin. So it's pushing to origin. Okay, so what we're going to do now, if we look in our history, we can see this is still here just as it was before. But if we go to the GitHub website and we refresh the page, you will need to refresh the page. Okay, you will now see that you have a bit of code on your website. And by code in this case, well, we mean a text file. We haven't actually added any code up here, but you have a text file. Okay, so this is now actually has all of our information up on the GitHub hosting website. It now has our most up-to-date copy of the repository. Now, this is almost all of the basic operations. We learned about cloning, we learned about committing, and we learned about pushing. The only one we haven't learned about is pulling. And that's whenever there is a change that is on the host repository, the origin, that isn't yet on our local computer. Now, why would that ever happen? Well, if you're working with a team, that's one reason that would happen. Or if you are working on multiple computers and you make a change on one computer, you push that change up to the origin website, and then you go to another computer, you sit down, well, the local version won't have that change, so you need to click pull and pull it down. So how will we learn that? I'm not going to make you go onto another computer. Instead, I'll show you, you can actually edit files on the website. Now, normally you won't need to do this. This is not a common thing that you'll need to do. But it's useful here because it can show you how to pull changes down to your computer. So let's try it. If you go into test.txt, we click on that. All right, we can now see our file. And on the right-hand side, there is a fancy little pen. If you click on that, you can edit the file right there in the web browser. Let's add a new line and call it, this is a new line, or whatever you want to add to your file. You could write a poem if you want. You could draw an ASCII art. It doesn't matter. Add something to the file so that you know that it's changed. All right. At the bottom, you can just scroll down just like you would in GitHub Desktop in the actual GUI. If you made a change, you would have to make a commit message to go along with the change to explain what you changed in that update. All right, so here we're going to say added a new line to test.txt for testing purposes. All right, and you could add more information in the description if you want, but in this case, that one line is plenty of information. A quick note about commit messages. You do not need to put your name, the date, or a list of the files that were changed, because all of that information will actually be included in the commit anyway. Your name, the date, and a list of the changed files. Instead, you are summarizing overall what features you added, what bugs you fixed, etc. Right? This is not, you don't need to write the date and stuff. All that's going to be included automatically whenever you make the commit. So don't bother putting the date and things in there. Okay? All right, anyway, so once you've added a commit message, you're going to go down to the bottom and you're going to click Commit Changes, just like you did on GitHub Desktop. So we're in the web right now, but the system's still very much the same. So you click Commit Changes, and you can now see that the version of the text file online has 2 lines of text. All right, now if we want to see a history of our entire repository, I'll show you how to do that, but you can also actually look at a history of just this file. When you have the file open, you can click on history here. You can see the commits that have affected this file, but a lot of times you want to see the history of the entire repository. And if we click on code, we can then see this thing where it says 2 commits on the right-hand side. If you click on that, it will show you all of the commits that are part of this repository. 2 right now. The first one where we added the file, and the second one where we added a new line to the file. And you can see all of these here. Okay, that's fantastic. But if we go back to our GitHub Desktop, which is our local computer on our computer, this GitHub Desktop, this is what is actually on our computer. The version on the website, we don't have that on our computer. If we were running Unity or Visual Studio or something, we couldn't actually run that code. So if we add something on the computer, we need to actually, or on the website, we need to actually get it down to our computer. How do we do that? Right? Because if you can see here in GitHub Desktop, our history still only has 1 commit in it. Okay, so the answer is we need to pull. Now, helpfully, GitHub just combines the push and pull button all into one. So in the top right corner here, you can see where it says fetch origin. It'll say that because it doesn't yet know that the origin, the hosting version of the repository, the host version of the repository, the one online, which is called origin, it doesn't yet know that there is a new change for us. Periodically, it will fetch those changes on its own, but if it hasn't fetched them yet, you can always click fetch origin, and it will go up and check. If there is a change, it will change to say pull origin, and it will have a 1 going downward. So this is not like Google Drive and Dropbox that automatically syncs. You have to click the button to do it. So it's really important that when you first sit down to start working, you always check if there are any new changes to pull down. Because if you don't, you may run into problems where you have multiple people changing the same file, the same line in the same file, and it can sometimes cause merge conflicts, which we'll cover in a later tutorial. All right, so right now we can see we have one change, one with a downward arrow, which means one change that should come down from the website to our computer. So that's a downward arrow, it means coming down to our website from our computer. So if I had a change on my computer that needed to go up to the website, it would say push and it would have an up arrow, okay? If you have both, you're gonna have to pull before you can push, right? We are not allowed to push up to the cloud without having all the changes locally. Okay, so let's go ahead and click pull origin, and it will pull the file from the website and put it onto our computer. And as you can see here in the history, we now have 2 commits. And let's actually go and check our real file on our computer. Has it changed? So click on repository, click on show and explore, or you can just reopen your folder if you still have it open. You've got your test.txt. If you double click it, you'll see you've got your second line of text or whatever it was you added into that text file. It will be there. So that is all of the operations for version control. You have learned how to clone an entire repository onto your computer. That's useful if you're on a new computer and you want to copy your repository onto it. And that's usually what it's used for. Or if you're first creating a repository, you've created it online, you're pulling it onto your computer. All right? You've learned how to make a commit, which takes a snapshot of your project and stores it in the repository's database. You've learned how to push that commit and any others you've made up to the cloud host of your repository, which is called the origin, up to origin. You've learned how to then also fetch by checking if there's any changes and pull any changes down onto your computer from origin, right? That's the main steps to version control. That will build up this database of changes as you work on the project. We have not covered what to do when you want to go back, which is called reverting changes. We have not covered that yet. We have not covered what happens when you need to merge 2 people's changes. And we've not covered branches. And we've not covered a very important concept called a git ignore. So these things I will cover in later tutorials. But for now, you have enough to practice. So what I would like you to do now is go ahead and delete this text file. Commit the fact that the file was deleted. And when you delete the file, you do it in the normal way that you would delete a file anywhere on your computer. So go and find the file and delete it. Commit the fact the file was deleted. Create a new file and write a poem. Send the poem up to the origin website by committing it and pushing it. On the origin website, edit the poem in some way, and then back on your computer, pull that change back down and open the text file and confirm that your poem has been changed. So that is my recommendation as a way to practice what you have learned. Please try it now. If you run into trouble, please ask in the comments. I have also included another Kahoot that you can use to practice, to test your knowledge. And it covers each of these operations and terms that we've talked about in this tutorial so that you can learn them. Also in the description, along with the Kahoot, is a text version of this tutorial that I've created, a website version of it, with pictures and text if that is easier for you, and to use as a reference if you need to. So I hope this was all very helpful for you, and I hope you look forward to future version control tutorials that we'll be doing together. Thank you very much. Bye.